Victoria has recorded another significant jump in the number of coronavirus cases. The ABC understands more than 650 new infections have been detected in the past 24 hours. In response, Premier Daniel Andrews is expected to announce some of the harshest restrictions to be imposed in Australia. Reporter Elias Clure joins us live now from Melbourne. Elias, just take us through what Victorians are bracing for, especially as we wait for that official announcement of more than 650 new cases today.
Good afternoon to you, Miriam. Well, the Premier Daniel Andrews has flagged that everything is on the table. He's been meeting with Cabinet Ministers as well as his Chief Health Officer, Professor Brett Sutton, and poring over the data to determine the next steps in this lockdown. Now, the ABC understands those next steps could be restrictions on discretionary retail, abattoirs, which has been the cause of a number of clusters across Victoria, as well as call centres. Now, the specifics of those, of course, will be ironed out by the Premier later today. Now, in terms of schooling, 11s and 12s are back at school, but they could have to return to online schooling to complete their VCE, which could have significant ramifications. There could also be restrictions on ride shares and taxis, and it's still unclear whether there'll be a reduction in services on Victoria's public transport network. Now, there's also a consideration of postcode restrictions and how far people can leave their homes. But of course, Daniel Andrews will have to paint a clearer picture later in the day at his press briefing for Victorians who, quite frankly, are on edge right now.
So, Elias, this, of course, is all due to those figures continuing to rise and, of course, the deaths that we're seeing, many of them in aged care facilities. What's prompting the Premier to take these steps now?
Well, there's a number of statistics that are of particular concern to the Premier. So there's over 6,000 active cases now in Victoria. Cases are jumping up and down, but we've also seen 49 mystery cases. They're cases that health authorities are unsure of the cause, a clear indication that community transmission is on the rise. There's also over 1,000 infections in healthcare amongst healthcare workers, over 300 people in hospital and over 40 people in intensive care. So hospital admissions are on the rise, a significant concern to the Premier. As you mentioned, aged care being ravaged by this second wave, over 1,000 cases across 100 different homes. So there's all manner of different areas that the Premier is concerned by, and he's acknowledged that he has to do something about it.
And Elias, it does seem that people are continuing to break the rules there across Victoria despite those stern warnings from police.
Miriam, 170 people were fined in the last 24 hours, a significant number despite the stern warnings issued by the police. The Deputy Commissioner said yesterday that it seemed as if people were still living as if a pandemic wasn't going on. A further 18 people were fined yesterday for not wearing masks, and that rule has been in place now for just over a week. Now, amongst some of the people fined, 10 people were fined for having a party in Wyndham Vale in Melbourne's west. 5 people were fined for having a birthday party at a CBD venue that was of course supposed to be closed, and another 5 people were fined for holding a religious gathering also in Melbourne's west. So disappointing news to learn, especially given we're on the brink of further restrictions now, Miriam.
Elias Clure there with the latest from Melbourne. Now, we are also expecting an update from Premier Daniel Andrews this afternoon. We'll be bringing that to you live on the ABC News channel once it gets underway. One new case has been recorded in Queensland overnight. It was from a returning traveller overseas. He's currently in hotel quarantine. Lexi Hamilton-Smith has more from Brisbane.
This was a man who actually works in the diplomatic corps, so he was given an exemption. He flew in from Kabul to Sydney, where normally most people have to quarantine once they land in Australia. He would have had to quarantine for 2 weeks, but because of his consular role, he was given an exemption to then fly on a domestic flight to Maroochydore in Queensland. He got tested immediately then and went into quarantine and has now tested positive in the last 24 hours. So the Chief Medical Officer, Jeanette Young, has defended that and said they may look at reviewing it, but they have to keep some of these important government roles still working during this crisis. So she makes no excuses for the fact that he was allowed to do what most Australians are not. But she says she's not worried about this infection because the airlines themselves, as you know, have some incredible filtration systems. Every 5 minutes the air is being refreshed. And she said while they are now contact tracing people that were on the Jetstar flight, she isn't greatly concerned, but she still wants people to come forward. The flight was a Jetstar one, as I said, JQ790. Now, case-wise, we've had some 13,000 tests, Miriam, in the last 2 or 3 days, and only 2 other cases have come forward from those. Now, they're related to those 2 women who skipped through quarantine and allegedly lied about being in a Melbourne hotspot, came through to Sydney, and then also allegedly destroyed some mobile phones so that police couldn't actually track where they had been. Those 2 women have been charged with falsifying documents and also with fraud, and they're still under guard in a hospital here in Brisbane. A 3rd woman has also been charged at this point. But look, they're saying it's just incredible. We potentially were expecting hundreds of cases out of this particular outbreak, which she's calling a Melbourne outbreak. But she said also there is no room for complacency. We spoke to her just not long ago.
We've got to keep alert for at least the next week before we can say we're out of that risky period. So we've got another week that we just have to be so alert, and another week of everyone maintaining social distancing and doing everything as people have been doing so well.
Jeanette Young there. Now, Lexi, are there still concerns, though, over aged care facilities in the state?
Look, there certainly is, because one of the 2 couples that have been infected because of the women's situation where they roamed around Logan, Ipswich and Brisbane for 8 days while they were infected with COVID-19. One of those 2, a husband and wife, she did work at the Pinjarra Hills Aged Care Facility. So she's positive. They've now tested nearly all the residents there and those tests have come back negative. So that still remains in lockdown. But as of midday today, as a precaution, they will now lock down other aged care facilities. We're talking over 100, potentially 200, like they did in March in Brisbane, Ipswich, Logan, Redlands, Gold Coast and the Scenic Rim. So you may recall that that time for us up here, it was no relatives allowed to visit those aged care homes. This will remain in place indefinitely at this point until we get more tests back. As Dr Young said, it's still a critical time in Queensland, so they want to get a lot more people tested to just understand whether this outbreak, the Melbourne outbreak that's affected the south of Brisbane, is actually under control. But we have been extremely lucky here so far, and she just keeps saying we don't want a second wave like we're seeing in Melbourne, and we our thoughts certainly are with our southern counterparts. It's a very difficult time for all down there.
To news, just in New South Wales has recorded 12 new cases of COVID-19 in the 24 hours to 8 p.m. last night. We are expecting to get more details from New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian later this hour. We'll be bringing that to you live here on the ABC. Now, this number comes after the state recorded its first coronavirus-related death since May yesterday. The 83-year-old was part of the Crossroads Hotel cluster in Sydney's southwest. The state is cracking down on health breaches as it tries to avoid widespread community transmission. A hotel in Sydney's east has been fined $5,000 for failing to enforce social distancing, and from tomorrow, face masks will be required in some major retailers. The Commonwealth is pulling out of a legal challenge against WA's hard border. The Prime Minister has written to Premier Mark McGowan informing him the government will no longer participate in the court action initiated by Clive Palmer. The mining billionaire argues the border restriction is unconstitutional. The Commonwealth agrees but doesn't wish to participate in the case any further. Mr McGowan says he hopes the federal government's withdrawal hasn't come too late.